Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I've got Bobbie with me, and we're going to be talking about the difference between startup and legacy innovation, so to speak. But before I get to all the questions that I've got for you, Bobbie, can you give everybody an introduction?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Emma. My name is Bobbie Collies. I am the Chief Insurance Officer at Coterie Insurance. Super fortunate right now to be leading both the underwriting team and the distribution and marketing team. So it's been super fun to kind of coalesce those together and really drive profitable growth as we're scaling really fast. And I'm celebrating 20 years in the insurance industry next month. I've only been in InsurTech the last year and a half. Prior to that, I spent the 18 years, I guess, in legacy incumbent carriers, mostly regional carriers in the Midwest. But yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation. Lots of different viewpoints here.
Well, congratulations on your anniversary. That's a big accomplishment. I'm excited for you.
It just means I'm old. It just means I'm old.
No, it doesn't. Because then the rest of us are too, Bobbie. Don't worry. So I do want to tap into, maybe as we get started with the conversation, a bit more of that like carrier side and not startup. I don't want to call them legacy because they are still relevant today, but they're not startups. So, and you and I, when we were prepping for this, you used the phrase FOMO as like the way to get things done in a established organization when it comes to innovation. Can you explain that idea and maybe talk a little bit about what it's like trying to get one of these big companies steered in an innovative direction?
Yeah, absolutely. So what was interesting is when InsurTech started to hit our industry, there was a lot of opportunity for carriers to make changes. But here's the thing, Emma, there's most carriers, at least prior to this year, because this year's kind of weird with cat losses and some of the things we're seeing with the hardening market. They've been fat and happy for a long time, right? They're meeting or beating most growth goals and loss ratio goals. Their C-suite's making money. So driving change and innovation really wasn't a thing because they didn't want to, they didn't have to. So really the only way to get something done within that world was to say, look, this is what you'll lose. And creating the fear of missing out or what they lose in their current numbers or their current strategy. Versus in startup world, it's a lot easier to sell an opportunity. So it was like an opportunity cost, fear of missing out, versus this is how we could grow and this is the opportunity in front of us. So it's been an interesting dynamic and an interesting observation.
Yeah.
The transition.
Well, and that is like, again, from a psychological standpoint, in getting people to move in the direction of change, there has to be a powerful enough why, and often like that, this is what you're missing out on, or this is the pain that we're going to remove, are like the two most powerful levers to pull during that.
Yeah.
But let's talk about now your experience being on the startup side, because I've had clients there. I've worked side by side with a number of these companies going through change, and it looks very different. So can you talk a little bit about what it's like spurring and continuing the momentum behind innovation within a startup?
Yeah. At times it feels like chaos. I'm not going to lie. So prior carrier world, lots of governance, lots of process built around driving change. In startup world, there isn't a lot of process. There's not a lot of governance. So a lot of folks are driving change, sometimes doing things, with the communication isn't always awesome. But what I will say is things are moving quickly, change is happening fast, progress is happening super fast, and just iterating in like that agile environment is much different in a startup world because we are releasing things so much more quickly than we ever would have, or I ever would have experienced with a traditional carrier. It's like night and day, like two sides of the pendulum. Like there's like, it's so polarized. It's ridiculous, but I'm learning so much because it's a different environment to lead in, right?
Well, and that's the thing, is there's got to be some sort of sweet spot somewhere in the middle, because you're overwhelmed by different things on either end. You've got too many barriers that you're trying to jump on one side with too much governance. And I want to tap into that idea a little bit more as we kind of maybe change directions on people beyond what they think that this conversation is going to look like. But then also there is such a thing as too much change, because it can be difficult to set your sights on a goal if things are constantly moving and shifting and changing in a way where you can't find a foundation. But so I want to come back to this idea again of like within the legacy environment. You mentioned the idea of governance and rules, and you and I were having the conversation of the thought process behind these rules or governance are often tied to one specific event. So I use the example of like previous company before I started had Beer Fridays. And the story was that like they had Beer Fridays for years until that one guy stayed after work and drank all the beer in the fridge. And so it's like there's always that one guy who ruins Beer Friday for everybody. And when we look at like innovation, that's one thing, that governance and rules are put in place because there was lessons learned. But how does this relate to like legacy underwriting and the thought process that you've seen in that paradigm as well?
Yeah, it's that one loss. It's not the one guy that drank all the beer on Friday. It's the one loss that various underwriting leaders have experienced over their career, and then they inject these underwriting rules, or they put this one question on the supplemental application because they had a poor experience, maybe with a certain class of business or a certain geography or something, right? And so one of the really cool things that I'm excited about Coterie doing is taking the bias out of the underwriting process, because we have an automated underwriting engine. Every single rule is applied exactly the same. We don't have supplemental applications that have random questions that may or may not be tied to actual loss experience, but maybe one event. So that's been super fun and different. But the whole paradigm behind underwriting and that one Beer Friday guy needs to change, right? And so that's something that we're pushing kind of through the industry, and that we're starting to see some even incumbent carriers start to think a little bit differently about the questions they're asking and paring back the questions that might not be relevant anymore.
I think that to your point, we don't have to make decisions based this poor guy. I don't even know who he was. He was gone before I got there. But Beer Friday guy, like, we're able to move beyond that because of data and because of the insights that we have now. And I would agree, it's really cool to look at how we can start bringing that information into the decisions that are being made. And honestly, I was one of the first people that not in the commercial realm, but in the personal line side, like, I don't necessarily want telematics, like letting you know that I speed sometimes, like that thought process went in my mind. But then at the same time, when you take the step back and you look at the benefits of personalization, I think that there's like a far outweighing in that weighing scale of like personalization ultimately benefits the customer more often.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that whole concept of that personalization has been a little bit difficult for us at Coterie, because if you think about traditional carrier appetite, ours isn't like on the same level, because we will underwrite a risk differently that's 2 blocks away from, one risk is here, the other risk is 2 blocks away. And they're not treated the same, even if they're both coffee shops, right, within the same city, because we're underwriting not by the law of large numbers, but by individual risk characteristics, which often makes it sometimes hard for our agents to understand, like, why would you take this one but decline that one, right?
Yeah. There has to be kind of like that education and just that like slow change of behaviors and patterns over time, which, again, going back to the beginning of the discussion, might take a little bit longer than we'd like it to. Thank you so much for joining me for the discussion, Bobbie. If you're not already, make sure you follow Bobbie and Coterie. She's got a podcast that I've had the opportunity to sit in on before, so keep an eye out for that as well. And certainly reach out to either one of us if you've got any questions. But have a wonderful day, everybody, and thank you again. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Leading Change. If you liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe and come back weekly for more expert interviews on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.